Good afternoon. I'm Alistair Young. I'm a professor here in the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs, and I direct our Jean Monnet Center of Excellence. And it is our great pleasure this afternoon to introduce and to host Her Excellency Caroline Vicini, who is the Deputy Ambassador for the European Union in the United States. She's been in that capacity since September, and she's sort of been learning the ropes of that job, which includes the unenviable, the challenging task of coordinating the 28 EU member states. So it sounds like a daunting task. Dealing with administering academics is often described as herding geese. I'm sure she's too diplomatic to describe the member states in that way. But in that capacity, she's been particularly preoccupied with responding to the moves to restrict the the visa waiver program. But because she's been preoccupied with those activities, this is her first trip in her official capacity outside of DC. So we're very honored to be hosting her here. It is also her first trip to Atlanta, though not her first trip to Georgia, which provokes the question, how can you come to Georgia without coming to Atlanta? And the answer is in an RV. She is actually a Swedish diplomat who is temporarily working for the European Union, and in the elegant language of the European Union, that makes her a temporary agent. Never misses the classy title there. So before coming to her current posting, she was the chief of protocol in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Sweden with the rank of ambassador. So on behalf of the Atlantic Council on International Relations, who's sponsoring this event, did a lot of the heavy lifting, and the Jean Monnet Center of Excellence, I'd like to welcome all of you, particularly Consul General Barbet. This talk. Hi.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alistair, for that nice introduction. And hello, everybody. Very nice to see you all here, and really nice to come to Atlanta. I had maybe from visiting Savannah a bit different view of Georgia, but here I see the modern Georgia instead. And I'm really happy to be here at this outstanding university and to talk to you. And I'm really happy also to see that we have a group of people who are studying European affairs and who are interested in Europe and what's happening in Europe. I think it's very, very important that we continue to cultivate the interest among young people to get to know Europe. It's a fantastic place, very multifaceted. And that is one of the EU's challenges. And we have this slogan, we are united in diversity. And I think that's something that comes to many countries and many places in this world with the globalization. And we are already trying that out. So yes, Alistair Young, Professors Alistair Young and Vicky Birchfield, thank you for arranging this opportunity to speak with all of you about the challenges that are facing Europe and the United States in the coming year. Reading the grim headlines about Europe recently, you would be forgiven for thinking that an EU diplomat wouldn't be terribly keen to go out and give speeches about our agenda for next year, or for this year actually. Every day, pundits are busy predicting the demise of the European Union, the euro, Brexit, and general gloom and doom. No doubt, I think Europe will face many challenges in 2016. Many of our member states are struggling to deal with an influx of refugees on a scale not seen in 70 years, while also tackling sluggish growth, high levels of debt, and stubbornly high unemployment, especially among young people. But that is only a part of a much bigger picture, and I'm here just to tell you that while the European Union is grappling with some major issues, it, as it always does, it seems, comes to grips with finding solutions, and grow stronger as a result. You know that many have compared the European Union with a bike. You know, if it doesn't continue to move forward, it will fall over. And that's what has sort of spurred much of the integration that goes on continuously. I think we should start with the migration issue, because that is maybe the question that has been highest on the agenda and most in the media during the last 6-7 months. So foremost in people's minds at the moment is actually the refugee crisis, migration, and the impact it will have on the EU. This is a crisis that is unfolding on European soil, but whose origins lie far beyond its borders. Its conflicts in Afghanistan, in Syria, in Yemen, in Iraq, and continued and widespread and systematic violations of fundamental freedoms and human rights in Eritrea, extreme poverty in sub-Saharan Africa, and in failed and failing states, which have helped to contribute to the rise of non-state actors like ISIS. Since this time last year, at least 1.5 million desperate people have made their way to the European Union, risking their lives and leaving loved ones behind in order to find a better and more safe future. Several more millions are displaced in camps in Syria, in Iraq, Jordan and Lebanon, and thousands tragically never made it to safety. The pace and scale of this unabating humanitarian emergency have been challenging logistically and politically for the European Union and its member states, some of which, like Greece, were just emerging from a prolonged economic crisis. To give you a sense of the scale of this grave situation, if you compare the situation in Greece with something similar in the United States, it would be equivalent to 4 million refugees arriving in a state of the size of Texas over the same time period. As the crisis worsened, particularly over the summer months, the EU came in for criticism for not responding swiftly and coherently enough. Given the suffering involved, the frustration was understandable, but completely overlooks the fact that migration and asylum are not fully fledged EU policy areas like, for example, trade, where the Commission has the full competence. In this sense, the European Commission President Juncker deserves credit for identifying migration as a political priority even before he took office in 2014. So notwithstanding the gap in EU powers, the EU has moved as quickly as it could. Within months of the onset of the crisis, 28 sovereign member states managed to agree that action on EU level was needed. By May 2015, a comprehensive action plan was proposed by the Commission, and a few months later, concrete measures were adopted to step up and share the burden of the rescue efforts in the Mediterranean. To disrupt a business model and of unscrupulous smugglers, and to help authorities at external EU borders to register refugees for asylum purposes. And we also agreed to a system to relocate refugees across the EU. EU has also provided additional assistance to Turkey, to Syria's neighboring countries, and the Western Balkan countries on the front line of this disaster, and has created a trust fund for Syria and another one for Africa to address the migratory pressures from the south. The urgency of reallocating the refugees within the European Union has in the meantime become more acute, and there is no secret that this has also proved the most difficult part of the package to approve and to implement. The situation and the temporary reintroduction of border controls in 6 EU countries since the attacks in Paris are raising concerns about the future of the so-called Schengen area, a signature accomplishment of the Union. And I'm sure as you are students of EU affairs, you know that the Schengen area has a common external border, but that you are free to move within the area. And of course, the freedom of movement is one of the four pillars in the common market. So the challenges for this year will be to implement what has been agreed, in particular to relocate 160,000 refugees, to develop new legal channels of legal migration, to reform the so-called Dublin regulation that establish the first member state where refugee arrives is also responsible for the examination of the asylum application, and to resist, very important, conflating terrorism with the refugee crisis. Most of these refugees are running away from the same people who attacked Paris in January and November of last year. For all the heated debates on these issues, we must keep in mind two facts. Asylum seekers have international recognized rights. And secondly, what you are seeing and we are experiencing in Europe is dramatic, but it is only a manifestation of a much larger crisis of 60 million people displaced worldwide. Dealing with it successfully will demand an international response now and also in the longer term to address the root causes. Now I will move on to the EU-US relations, where we in Europe are following the presidential elections here like we were the voters, which we are not. But it's very closely followed, and we have, of course, an eye on, and there's continuously thinking about how the new president will impact the EU-US cooperation, the different dialogues we have, the different negotiations we have ongoing. And hopefully one thing is for sure, whoever and whichever candidate wins the White House, the alliance between the United States and Europe will remain vital and relevant. For us, that is extremely important because we share common values and a lot, actually, that binds us together. On a personal note, as this is my second diplomatic posting here in the United States, the first one was before the Lisbon Treaty took effect, and I see on a daily basis in what was mentioned here before in the coordination that I do of the 28 member states, how much has changed in less than a decade, how increasingly the EU is seen by the US administration as a partner with which the US can work and handle most of today's complex security challenges. This step and this steep change in our relations is particularly evident in how the EU and the US have worked together on two recent issues, the Iran nuclear deal and the Russia-Ukraine conflict. On Iran, which is very relevant these days with the implementation day just behind us around the corner, we agreed and implemented a joint program of sanctions to keep Iran at the bring Iran to the negotiating table. Last July, working with the United States, China, Russia, France, and Germany, we reached a deal that removes the threat of an Iranian nuclear bomb. And last weekend followed independent verification of Iran's compliance by the International Atomic Energy Agency. We lifted our sanctions. And I think most of you know that the European sanctions that were lifted was much wider than the lifts you had here in the United States. The agreement is a major diplomatic victory for the United States, represented by John Kerry, as positive. Another positive development, such as Iran's recent release of US hostages, demonstrate this as well. But a lot of kudos, I think, go also to the EU's High Representative, Vice President Federica Mogherini, and her predecessor, Catherine Ashton, for their deft and dogged diplomatic work in sharing the discussions, which at times were complicated, by, among many other things, Russia's illegal annexion of Crimea and support of separatist movements in Ukraine. In Ukraine, the EU is actively engaged in supporting efforts to reach a sustainable solution to the conflict in the east of the country. From the outset, the EU has supported Ukraine's territorial integrity, condemning the clear violations of Ukraine's sovereignty and the acts of aggression by the Russian armed forces. And the EU's approach has been to combine diplomatic efforts with sanctions in order to get to a constructive dialogue. And as you might know, also these sanctions has been quite heavily felt by many countries in Europe who had large exports of, among other things, food and agricultural products to Russia. We were very happy and pleased to join so quickly and effectively with the US on a program of coordinated sanctions designed to pressure President Putin to reconsider his destabilization actions. And the sanctions has been very effective, though the situation on the ground in Ukraine remains very fragile and no final solution has been found yet. In 2006, the hope is that we can progress with the full implementation of the Minsk Agreement and that we also can proceed with the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement, which will do very much to improve the conditions in Ukraine. We also hope that Russia, which has been, as we said earlier, an important partner in Syria and the Iran negotiations, will do all in its power to play a constructive role. While we Europeans find it easy to criticize our shortcomings individually and collectively, we must remember that we have the ability to work, consult, and debate as 28 independent nations and reach a consensus as a union with a single voice and a purpose. This is a huge asset for ourselves and for our partners, including the United States. When we act together, that counts. We can be confident that we will be able to deal with the problems in our neighborhood, using the fullest of our soft power in the form of development assistance and trade agreements to its fullest extent, while also drawing on the deep and diverse diplomatic and security relationships of a number of states. Something else that binds us together, I think, even more and since a longer time back is the trade. And I think that is one of the reasons the United States trusts the EU as a partner, because the trade is a bedrock of our economic relationship and the interdependence built up over more than half a century. Today, some 15 million jobs are linked to the EU-US trade. Every day, we trade goods and services worth $2.7 billion. We, the EU and the United States, account for nearly 30% of global trade in goods and about 40% of world trade in services. And although we have seen unprecedented challenges in the EU area during the recent years, the US consistently directs half of its total foreign direct investments toward the European Union each year. Similarly, the EU continually accounts for almost 2/3 of foreign investments in the United States. Let me put this into context. In 2012, and I'm sorry this number is a little bit outdated, I think, 45 of 50 US states exported more to Europe than they did to China, and significantly more in many cases. So to unleash the full potential of this economic relationship that is already so wide, the EU and the US embarked in 2013 on the negotiation to remove remaining tariff and non-tariff barriers to trade, to promote regulatory convergence and get rid of duplicative requirements that costs our companies money and hinder competitiveness. I'm talking about the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership negotiations. This is called TTIP in short. But I'm sure you have heard more of another acronym that's very similar, the TPP, and because that deal with the Asia and Pacific countries has already been concluded and is now awaiting approval of Congress. TTIP negotiations are now going into the 12th round. That's in February in Brussels. And we hope to conclude a robust agreement that benefits Americans and Europeans before the end of this administration. And I will spare you all the details because it's a very comprehensive negotiation. But this is a unique negotiation in that sense, and I think thanks to EU, because you can read a lot of the documents on the internet. It's the most transparent trade negotiation in history. That has been very, very important in Europe, where transparency is actually requested and where we have had a strong debate on TTIP. But the negotiators find this to be a good way of demystifying what is going on when people can actually see the documents. So, if we go back to where we are, what would this mean for the state of Georgia? The EU buys approximately 20% of Georgia's goods export and about 30% of its service export. A TTIP deal, if implemented, could increase Georgia's exports to the EU by over 30% and boost net employment up to 25 jobs. 25,000 jobs, not 25, that would be a little bit little. Right here in Georgia's 5th district, is that where we are? You think so? Okay, good, I trust you. The benefits of the EU-US trade relationship could be phenomenal in specialized sectors like medical devices and electrical machinery. It's been calculated that about 44% of increase of exports could be achieved. And there is, I could point that out, a very good, if you have to write something at one point in time, there is a very good source at the British Embassy's webpage where they have district by district what benefits you could get out of a fully fledged TTIP deal, both in terms of export and additional jobs. But I think what is a very important thing in this, and I think there maybe we on the EU side have higher ambitions than on the US side, is that we find this to be a once-in-a-generation opportunity to modernize how we do business. And we need to do that because we are still the largest economic corridor in the world, but our share is declining. So only by leveraging this relationship that is so old and actually full of trust, we can remain and we can be sure to be truly competitive in a changing global economy. Because the TTIP has also a geostrategic importance. Concluding TTIP will send a message to the rest of the world that the EU and the US are not complacent, but we are able to make the changes that will set the new gold standard for trade and investment and allow our companies and workers to compete in a changing global economy. Although the transatlantic relation is so good, and I think we can all sign under to that statements, there are, of course, tensions. And they come up regularly and automatically, and we do not have to call for them. We have a couple of challenges that we are at the EU delegation are working very hard on right now, and also our colleagues in Brussels, of course, and American colleagues here in Washington. One is data privacy. We are reaching a deadline or approaching a deadline for a new EU-US safe harbor agreement. following the suspension of the existing agreement because of the European Court of Justice ruled out it did not protect adequately the data of European citizens. And I don't know if any of you know of this agreement. It's an umbrella agreement that covers all the transfer of personal data. So when you use Facebook or any other social media, that data often goes over, if you communicate with somebody on the other side of the transatlantic, of course, but also because these companies use servers on both sides. But also the industry uses this, because a lot of data is now, as you know, who are engineering students here, are now included in what we produce directly. Like a car, for example, today, a modern car sends data back to the headquarters continuously. But as the car is owned by somebody, this is personal data, so it falls under this protection. So there is a huge number of companies that have been affected by the fact that this agreement was struck down by the European Court of Justice. And interesting for you as who are students, it was an Austrian law student. This Mr. Schrem is an Austrian law student who is a privacy crusader and apparently quite versatile in EU law, because he managed to bring this case all the way up to the European Court. And he has immediately said when this went through, when he was on the winning side, that he will continue. So we presume that the day we get a new safe harbor agreement in place, it will quite quickly be challenged in court. And that starts in a national court somewhere. He brought this case to an Irish court, actually, because it was against Facebook. But it could be brought to court anywhere in Europe where a company is headquartered, and could be any other company. This time it was Facebook, it could be something else next time. Another thing that is very topical just today is the changes that the United States has done in the visa waiver program. I don't know if you are familiar with the visa waiver program. There is an agreement between the United States and the EU that says that we can travel without visas for tourism and visits, business, and similar activities. And that allows you as US students to travel to any EU country without requesting a visa. And it allows Europeans to travel to the United States for 3 months for visits and so on. That agreement was changed a few years ago when the US introduced the so-called ESTA, which is actually a web page where you have to go in and register your travel before you go, and you have to get an acceptance. And with the data you enter, the US Department of Homeland Security is checking this against different databases in order to prevent presumably terrorism. I think that's the purpose. Unfortunately, this system was changed again by Congress in a decision that came very quickly before Christmas and in the Omnibus Bill. And today that entered into force. And entered into force also, unfortunately, without previous notice to the European public. So today, 16,000 European citizens who have an ESTA, which is a valid ESTA, will have see that withdrawn because they have a dual nationality. They are of any European nationality, but also Iranian, Syrian, Sudanese, or Iraqi. Or they have traveled to one of these countries the last 5 years. Of course, we on the European Union side find this unacceptable, but the law is the law, and this has now been introduced. And this is particularly problematic because we also have 5 countries that are not part of the visa waiver program, and we would like them to have the same freedom of travel as all the other EU countries. And that has been our goal, and now things are going the other way around. So this is presumably linked then to terrorism, but we find this to be a bit bizarre, because many of these people that we have who have this dual citizenship, they have actually fled from these regimes. If you are a Syrian who find yourself since many years in Europe, it's because you have gone away from Assad, presumably. If you are an Iranian, it's because you don't like the current Iranian regime. And many of these citizenship you cannot get away from. You have them for life. Even if you get another citizenship, you cannot renounce this one. So terrorism is not new, and this is something which many of our member states have experience of. So in the wake of 9/11, the EU considerably strengthened its international cooperation and instrument to prevent and protect, pursue and respond to the threat posed by terrorist groups. The kind of terrorism being perpetrated by the likes of ISIS is a shared challenge on which the US and its allies have been moving in the same direction. And we need to, of course, to continue to work together and not be provoked by those who wish to limit our freedom. Any enhancement of the visa waiver program must ensure that it remains fit for purpose, both in protecting our citizens and our homelands, while also facilitating the legitimate pleasure or business travel of those who share the common democratic values. What else is waiting us in the future? Brexit is another interesting topic. The debate in Brexit is, as most of you know, a decision of the United Kingdom to potentially leave the European Union after more than 40 years of membership. And the UK will have a referendum before the end of next year, and most of us believe that it will come actually quite soon. And much will be said on both sides of the Atlantic on this issue in the run-up to the referendum. And fundamentally, from the EU side, we must say this is a democratic decision for the British people. We cannot shy away from the significance of this decision for the European Union as a whole. And we must see it as an opportunity for some honest debate. So Prime Minister Cameron is negotiating with the member states and with European institutions and for a deal, and that deal will then be presented to the British people. And we have to be confident that there's an outcome favorable to the UK and European Union that can be reached at European Council next month. Other things, I think we all are pleased on both sides of the Atlantic that we reached a landmark international agreement, the COP21 on climate change in Paris last December. And much credit goes actually to the French government that showed such leadership to bring this conference to a good end in the wake of Paris attacks. But now comes the hard part, and that is when we have to turn this rhetoric and this agreement into reality. And as the EU has pushed for an international climate change agreement since 2003, we think that we are well placed to match the pledges with meaningful, concrete measures. And we look forward to work with the United States on that. We also believe that there is much value in a green economy and green technology that can bring new jobs and new technology out to a larger audience. We see a worry in the last IMF forecast about a potentially rapid slowdown in China, which could feed back in our economies in a negative way. Some years ago, we were worried about China growing too fast and becoming an economic giant. But now I think we fear that it's going to contract too quickly. And that's why it's also in our interest to see that we have our own trade that is solid and sound and can develop, so we can find alternative markets with each other if China takes a dip for a while. So while it can be tempting to look at the EU only through the prism of current news, Much is happening beyond the headlines to restore Europe's economic vibrancy, to deepen our single market, the largest in the world, in sectors that are key to our competitive future and will make us more attractive for doing business. We are now having as top priority to create new jobs and stimulate investments. And the EU has launched a 315 billion euro investment plan, and that is already up and running less than a year after it was decided. And we are also building a new capital markets union to support EU's ability to fund growth. We're also developing a digital single market, and we hope that all our economies will benefit from the full power of the internet. So Europe in the 21st century is a global actor, and we will have strategic choices to make on how far we will go with integration, accepting that many or some will not be interested in going further. There's no easy answer to that question because there's no blueprint for what the European Union is meant to become. It's been built in stages, fits and starts, through painful negotiation according to a process that has become more democratic and more contested over time. But when the EU does reach an agreement, and it has done so on financially and regulatory reform, on banking union, on economic governance in the wake of the euro crisis, it sticks and it makes us stronger. I'm also confident that we can reach such an agreement with the United States on TTIP and on the areas where we currently have some disagreement. Much more unites us than divides us, and when we differ, it's usually about the method rather than the substance. We are still, as Vice President Biden said so well, each other's partners of first resort. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that comprehensive speech. There's no doubt that how crowded the agenda for 2016 is. It's also striking how shared much of that agenda is, either directly in terms of cooperation or indirectly in terms of ramifications for internal decisions on each party affecting the other. So we now have about 15 minutes for questions. We need to get the Deputy Ambassador to the airport so that she can get back to Washington before the world collapses. Everything's looking good for the moment. The snow's not supposed to come until tomorrow afternoon. It looks like you'll have a nice weekend of just
I'm a Swede. I will enjoy it all the way out.
Maybe everybody else will be. You go around and you can laugh at people as I was there. So I'll open the floor to questions.
Thank you very much for being here. I have a question about Nord Stream 2. So this is, I understand, been quite divisive, within Europe, but it also speaks to some of the issues, the Paris Accord and diversification of EU sources of EU energy. So I wonder if you have any comment on the controversy surrounding the project.
Yes. First of all, this I can see the proposal of Nord Stream 2 will be examined by the Commission according to all the European legislation, and that has not been done yet. So we wait for an outcome of that part. On the political part of it, which you can't really deny, is of course the fact that the Nord Stream 2 would transport more Russian gas into the European market and into the German market first, but eventually to be sold elsewhere. And the criticism that we have seen on that is that it undermines other projects, notably the projects for Ukraine to gain money on the transit of Russian gas through Ukraine, and some of the European countries that are on the other end of that gas corridor, that link. There was also, the EU has put a lot of attention to the European Energy Union, which has been announced, and the reconfiguration, so to say, of the European gas nets to create less of a dependence on Russia. And investments has been made by several countries to open LNG terminals to be able to receive shipments of LNG from the Middle East, but also hopefully from the United States. And that's true that might be a threat to that part, because it brings in more Russian gas. As you all know, now we have, with the very low oil price also, it's a kind of tricky situation, because everybody knows that probably it will not remain like this, but it's hard to know if you can invest further, and much of the investments in LNG and so has dried out. I think what we can say, so the debate is there, it's absolutely relevant, and I think it plays out. But what the Commission can do is to look at this and see if all the criteria in the according to EU law is there.
Do you believe is there a consensus of the EU members to, in fact, say to the Assad regime to stop the total massacre of its people? And that also brings us back to the fact that if that's the case, the EU right now, with Putin's involvement, right?
In the negotiations, yeah.
Yeah. You get about 52% of your revenue is coming from Russia right now. And so or their trade, trade. So my point is, is follow the money, follow the politics, follow what's going on. Do you think that the EU, because of the amount of trade that they do with Russia, would have any impact on what was going on in Syria? And could they influence or impact that at all?
Well, the 52%, that is a number that I do not recognize, and I think certainly now with the sanctions, there's no possibility that the EU has.
I'm sorry, that was as of 2008.
Yeah, even that, it seems very high, I
So
think.
share of natural gas imports?
No, I said trade.
It's not trade.
No.
Trade is tiny.
It's of course the EU trade with Russia was much bigger than the US trade with Russia, undoubtedly so. But those are not the numbers of today. Unfortunately, I don't have the numbers, but I think with the sanctions, we have shown that we actually have put the interests of, in this case, Ukraine before our own. I mean, there is a lot of agriculture, especially food-producing companies, but also other companies that are suffering greatly from the sanctions and the counter-sanctions from Russian side. That part, I think there's no doubt that we are standing up for Ukraine. When it comes to Syria, we have all along said that Assad must step down. As you know, now there has been a development. I think there has been a recognition among those who are involved in this negotiation that we hope will move forward, that maybe we cannot claim that Assad will have to step down from day one, but a possible agreement will be a sort of trajectory when he will step down at a certain point in time. I mean, I'm talking about theories here because we are not at all even close to something like that. I mean, EU has all the way through condemned Assad of what he is doing against his own people. Already before the civil war started, we criticized the Assad regime for its humanitarian or human rights record for the lack of democracy, etc. So I think we have a very, very clear record there, and we have been very upfront with our policy all the time.
I understand the European Union has sent a special envoy to the Colombian peace process,
Mm-hmm.
but what is the position of the European Union within the process?
When it comes to the Colombian peace process, we are of course interested in seeing finally a solution to the situation in Colombia that has gone on for these negotiations have been going on for a very long time, and we think the Colombian people merits to live in a country of democracy and without fear, and where you can come to a solution of this very deep conflict. And what the EU tries to do is to be able to help out in the conflict. We are also offering Colombia, of course, support that it might need to build up certain institutions, or in areas which have been under more of foreign control. The government might need to come in and provide better services, and we try to be helpful in that sense.
Would you elaborate on your impressions of the United States from 10 years ago when you were first here and those you have today?
Well, then you speak with Caroline Vicini and not with the EU Deputy Head of Delegation, because in that role I have no way to elaborate on that. This is, as I said before to someone, this is not my first election campaign. I was here at the sort of nowadays legendary campaign when Obama managed to become the Democratic nominee, and we had Sarah Palin on the stage, and all those things happened, and that was very interesting. What I want to say is that I think we see that Europe, the political landscape in Europe, as diversified as it is with 28 countries, and what we see here in the United States have certain similarities, because the populism that we see, and you can have a right-wing populism, or you can have a left-wing populism, or you can have populism that's just populism, and you say what people want to hear, and there can be different reasons for that. We have seen it in Europe. We have several parties of that type. We have also had several leaders, and have several leaders of populist parties who are actually reached the government and become heads of state and elsewhere. I can't mention anybody, but you all know what I'm talking about. And in the same vein, you see this debate here, where you all of a sudden hear things and you think, did I hear this? Did I hear correctly? Or was it, did I have my sound on the TV too low? Or things that you don't know really. Is there a basis for this? Is this what's going to happen? What will happen when this person, or one or another, without any kind of political record or very brief political record, gets into power? We have seen some experiments of that type in Europe, where you think a country is a company, for example, and it's just a question of management. And I think for us who are coming from the world of political affairs, and we don't believe in that. We think there's a difference between the business school and the School of International Affairs.
Last question.
You spoke a little bit about the EU's relationship with Iran, especially in light of new cooperation that's taken place. Do you foresee Iran's current conflict and emerging conflict with Saudi Arabia as affecting the EU's relationship with Iran in terms of sanctions or general diplomatic relations?
I heard somebody here, I must have been here in the United States, who described this conflict between Iran and Saudi Arabia in a very good way, I think, for somebody who, especially somebody who has had kids. You know, they have been kicking each other under the table for a long time. And you know, you are young, so you know when you kicked your brother or sister under the table, and then you know you got a smack. And I think that's stage we have reached now with the smack. You know, the open smack. It's not under the table anymore. And I think Iran hopefully will, and I think we have seen it, is coming out of some kind of isolation and becoming the active and necessary partner for good and for bad in the Middle East. It's a big country, it's a big civilization, and it's leading the Shiite current in the Middle East, and it's important that can be a player. On the other hand, we have seen also Saudi Arabia taking certain steps forward and become more, acting out more, getting involved with in Yemen, for example, and this is a conflict that has to be managed very, very carefully. And I think we believe that the fact that you have Iran as a responsible player at the table actually helps. It's better when you sit at the table and you can take, you have to look at the other part in the face, and you are not acting by other actors who are you sort of delegate your word to. We hope that also that with the lifting now of the sanctions, that the increased contacts with Europe, which it will be first of all until the United States decides to lift the sanction in a similar way, will benefit the Iranian population first of all, and hopefully strengthen those political currents that we would like to see develop there and become stronger, because it's still a very fragile political situation. So we hope that the big European or the big Iranian diaspora that we have in Europe can also be helpful to that extent, because many of them have kept very good relations with family and friends in Iran during all these years, although they have not liked the political regime.
Thank you. I've got this image in my head now that taking the comments about it's good to be able to sit down at the table with Iran, and the vision of Iran and Saudi Arabia kicking each other at the table, and I have a vision of John Kerry. Anyway, please join me in thanking Caroline Vicini for a wide-ranging talk. It's enlightened us about the rich and challenging
Life
nature
of
transatlantic
EU.
relations and the issues that are going forward.
Thank you to you.